Hi, everybody. I hope that you have successfully completed your diagrams, and be sure you are taking notes for this because you will have a quiz on Monday over the heart itself, the diagram, and also over part of this lecture. So be sure you're taking some good notes, okay? All righty. So I know you guys, as you start back, you've had a couple weeks off, and I thought this was kind of funny. To kind of get things started because cardiopulmonary is pretty heavy. It's a lot of information. And I know you guys are trying to get back in the swing of things so that you can be ready to roll and really start grasping that information. But it's hard after you've had a couple of weeks off. And just remember, it's just about 2 months until spring break, and you'll get a little break, and then a couple more months, and you'll have a summer vacation. So it's not that we don't have that much more time left to go. So what we're going to talk about first is we're going to talk about the heart. The heart is the main organ of the circulatory system. What you're seeing on the left is a good diagram of the heart. What you're seeing on the right is an actual sheep heart that has been prepared for dissection. You can see the coronary arteries there on the right. You can see on the left there, you can see, that's the exterior of it, and you can see what an actual heart looks like, as opposed to the diagram, this one has a lot of the similar things that are on your diagram, with the exception of you can't see the valves in this one. And in your diagram, you could see the valves. So like I said, the heart's the most important part of the cardiovascular system. It's where all blood is pumped. It's where it's sent from, deoxygenated blood comes into the heart. It's sent to the lungs. It's oxygenated. The largest vessels in the body are there. Your largest artery is your aorta. So you can see the ascending aorta and the aortic arch there. And you have the superior and inferior vena cava, which is the largest vein. And then you have your pulmonary arteries and veins. Now, one thing I will tell you, most people think all veins have deoxygenated blood and all arteries contain oxygenated blood, with the exception of for the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vein. So the pulmonary vein actually has oxygenated blood, and the pulmonary artery has deoxygenated blood. So I'm going to tell you guys that hopefully, by the time we get through with learning about the heart and we get to the test over the cardiovascular portion, you guys will know exactly how the heart, all of the blood gets oxygenated, deoxygenated, all the parts of the heart, and why that's so important. That's one of my main goals is, without our heart pumping, we're not alive. It's kind of like without the brain sending out nerve signals, we can't function. So another thing I like to talk about when we start talking about the heart is your heart starts beating about 10 weeks gestation. It's visible about 10 to 12 weeks gestation. It's visible on an ultrasound. But remember, once your heart starts beating, it never stops until you are no longer alive. So sometimes people have a heart attack and their heart stops for a minute or two, or sometimes they have an electrical shock that stops it. But if it stops, technically you've had cardiac arrest. So your heart continuously beats. That organ is constantly pumping blood and receiving blood and working. The right and left side are constantly working together to make sure that you get all the nutrients and the oxygen that the rest of your body needs. So it's kind of a really neat thing to think about. Also, another neat trivia thing about the heart is if you take two heart cells, one cell from my heart that's still beating, that's in a medium in a petri dish that can keep it still beating, and one of your heart cells, and you put them near each other, within just a very little amount of time, they will actually start beating at the same rate and the same rhythm. Where my heartbeat and your heartbeat right now may be different rhythms, if you put a single heart cell next to each other, they will actually start to beat in unison. So that's kind of a cool thing to know too about the heart. Okay, so let's talk about the heart specifically. So the heart is a hollow organ. It's a muscle. It has 3 layers. Generally, your heart is about the size of your fist. It sits at an angle in your chest, so it has it's in the mediastinum, which means medium means middle. Mediastinum is the middle part of the chest. It sits under the left lung, which is why the left lung has 2 lobes and the right lung has 3. There's got to be space in there for the heart, and it sits kind of at an angle. The point or the apex of the heart is near the diaphragm, and the top of the heart, where the atrium are, it kind of is at an angle over towards the left ribs. So there are 4 chambers to the heart. You have 2 atrium and 2 ventricle. We'll look at that a little closer in a few minutes. It's surrounded by a membrane called the pericardium. So when we every one of our organs has a membrane, an outer membrane that protects it, and that pericardium is so important because it keeps it from the heart from when as it's beating, and he keeps it from rubbing against the lungs, so that there's not any friction issues. The pericardial space is a fluid filled, so it nourishes and protects the heart. So the pericardial space is the space between the pericardium and the actual heart organ itself. And that fluid-filled space keeps it lubricated, keeps it moving, keeps it nourished, and keeps it protected. And so, like I said, the pericardium, the exterior, that membrane on the outside, keeps it from sticking to the lung itself. So let's talk a little bit more about the anatomy of the heart, some things that are pretty interesting and things you'll need to know. As you can look on the left, you're going to see a whole lot of diagrams of the heart as we go through here. That should tell you that diagram I gave you is very important, and I expect you to know that information. Remember that the right side of the heart is deoxygenated blood, which is why those pulmonary, and then the left side of the heart is oxygenated. So the right side of the heart is oxygenated. The left side of the heart is deoxygenated. It contains deoxygenated blood. And we'll talk about the cycle of blood here in a minute, but I just want you to kind of keep that in mind as we go in. The right side of the heart is deoxygenated blood, contains deoxygenated blood, and the left side contains oxygenated blood. So the heart, it's a very complex muscle. It controls our blood pressure. It has to do with our pulse. It has to do with nourishment of our body. It has to do with gas exchange. It's part of the gas exchange process, so that we keep oxygenated blood going to our body, and we get rid of that carbon dioxide and other things that we don't need. The heart pumps about 100,000 times a day. And it moves 7,200 liters or 1,900 gallons of blood every day. So think about you have about 6 liters, 5 to 6 liters of blood. So that's about 1.5 gallons of blood is what you have circulating. Like what your normal blood volume is, about 1.5 gallons, 1.5 gallons, 3/4. But it pumps that it pumps the equivalent of 1,900 gallons of blood every day. So your heart is the hardest working organ in your body. It beats 100,000 times a day, and it moves 1,900 gallons of blood every day. Once again, I told you just a little bit earlier, this looks a little more similar to what your diagram looks like. You have 4 chambers. You have 2 atria. You have a right and a left atrium. You have 2 ventricles. You have a right and a left ventricle. The atria, the 2 atriums, or the atria that you have, they are collection chambers. Blood comes into them. Blood comes into the right atrium from the superior and inferior vena cava, which is where all the deoxygenated blood comes in. And then it goes through the valve, the tricuspid valve, and it goes down into the ventricle, the right ventricle. The right ventricle is the ventricles are the pumps. They actually do the pumping action. They're pushing that blood out. So the right ventricle then sends that blood through the pulmonary valve, through the pulmonary artery, into the lungs, and then it comes back oxygenated from the pulmonary vein, and that goes into the left atrium, or the blood goes in there, goes through the mitral valve, down into the left ventricle, and then out to the rest of the body. That is the flow of blood in the heart. You will need to know that because you will have kind of an open-ended question on your test that says once blood in something similar to once blood enters the right atrium, describe every location the blood goes until it returns to the right atrium. That will be one of the questions you have on your test. So when I will have you talk about it. You're going to write a song or a rap about the flow of blood. So hopefully by the time we're done, you understand the flow of blood in the body. The heart has to maintain that even pumping action. The right atrium have to pump at the same time. The atrium have to pump at the same time. The ventricles have to pump at the same time. So the pumping action the heart is constantly moving in a unidirect, so that to maintain that directional blood flow, so that everything is moving through the way it's supposed to. If you have a valve disorder, sometimes blood doesn't flow through, or it will regurgitate back up, which can cause other issues. But the heart has to be pumping effectively for appropriate gas exchange, fluid exchange, all of those kind of things to be happening. Functions of the heart, that's how we get our blood pressure. So when blood goes into the atrium, or when it's contracting, that's the systolic or the systole, or the top number on the blood pressure when you take a blood pressure. And when it relaxes, when the ventricles relax, that is when we have the diastolic, or the bottom number. The heart is separated into a pulmonary and systemic circulation. So like I said, systemic circulation would be on the right side, where blood comes from the body back into that right atrium. And the pulmonary side would be where the blood comes back from the lungs oxygenated and goes into the left atrium. Know that and let me go back to this one here. Know that the chambers of the heart are separated, and the sides of the heart are separated by the septum. The septum separates the right and the left, halves of the heart. Okay, so the valves are there, like I said, to ensure that blood only goes one direction. When we have a valve disorder, sometimes blood will kind of shoot back up into the wrong chamber, which can cause a lot of problems. So the valves are there to make sure that when they're open, blood flows through, and then they close, and that way when it pumps the other direction, it doesn't go back up into the chamber that it's not needed. So they are there to ensure that valves ensure that blood only flows one direction in the heart. What regulates our blood supply? Changes in the contraction rate. So to match the way blood is needed, or where blood is needed, or what's going on. Most healthy people can increase their cardiac output about 300 to 500%. So when does heart contraction, or when does the heart rate change? Most of you are very aware that if you get scared, your heart beats faster. And that's due to a release from a chemical in the brain. If you are exercising, running, putting out more physical effort, your heart rate will increase. So when your heart rate increases, your blood pressure also changes. Sometimes when we eat or when we're digesting food, that also changes our heart rate and our blood pressure. There are people who have damage to their heart, and they have something called congestive heart failure, or heart failure. And that's when the body cannot supply enough blood to the body, or it's not circulating, or it's not ejecting enough blood out of the left ventricle, so that the body gets the nutrition it needs. Because the heart is actually not just pumping oxygen. There's proteins, there's bicarbonate, which is part of the buffer system. There's all kinds of nutrients in the blood as well. Plus you have red blood cells that are carrying the oxygen. You have white blood cells that are circulating around to help fight infection. Whenever the blood comes back to the heart, it's bringing back carbon dioxide and waste and other things that we need to get rid of. So if the heart is not beating appropriately, if the heart is failing to meet the output that it needs, then what happens over time is other systems start to shut down, simply because the heart is not getting enough nutrition, enough hormones, enough enough hormones, enough fluids, enough of the waste going back the way it, or getting excreted from the body. That's not happening enough, so other systems start to fail. So once the heart starts to have damage, other systems start to have damage as well. Okay, the cardiac cycle. So this is we're going to start back on that, where we talk about and I want to look and see where we are on time. Okay, we're doing good on time. So the cardiac cycle is definitely something that we need to be aware of. We need to know. We need to understand. The heart, like I said, has two pumps that work together. The right is the pulmonary, and the left half is the systemic. The repetitive, sequential contraction. The contraction is the systole, which is the top number on your blood pressure, and the relaxation is called diastole, and that's where the heart chambers are relaxing. Blood moves through the circulatory system. Some areas it has a higher blood pressure. Some areas it has a lower blood pressure, depending on what it needs. Also, think about if the heart has to pump blood to get it to the rest of the body. The closer to the heart, probably the higher the pressure is. And as you get out further towards the fingers, the feet, the pressure in those vessels is less because think about the heart has to pump pump out the blood hard enough to get it out to the rest of the body. So the trunk of the body, the center of the body, the brain, the pressure is going to be stronger there for those to get so that the blood can actually get to the rest of the body. So here we're looking at the cardiac cycle. This the first part you're seeing is when the atriums are receiving blood. On the left side, let me see if I can get my little pointer thingy to work. So on the left side here, oh, sorry guys. Sorry, on the right side here, remember it's right as my left. So on the left side here, this is the superior vena cava, this is the inferior vena cava, and it is bringing deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. On the left side, you're seeing that the pulmonary veins are bringing oxygenated blood into the left atrium. And then when the tricuspid valve here and the bicuspid valve there open, blood is sent down into the ventricles. So deoxygenated blood goes down into the right ventricle, and oxygenated blood goes down into the left ventricle. Then what happens next? Blood fills, the valves will close, and the blood in the right ventricle goes out into the pulmonary arteries, which are these things here, the pulmonary arteries. And then in the left ventricle, that blood, when the ventricles pump, the left ventricle that has oxygenated blood, it is sending it out into the aorta and out into the rest of the body. That's the cardiac cycle. So you will have that. You will write that down. You will take notes. I'll ask you about it on your quiz, I promise. And I'll ask you, maybe which side of the heart has oxygenated, which side of the heart has deoxygenated. I may ask you where blood goes once it leaves the right atrium. I may ask you where it goes once it leaves the left ventricle. But you guys are going to need to know the cycle of the heart and the chambers of the heart and the different pieces of the heart. The septum, which this is the septum here in the middle. You're seeing, like I said, the superior and inferior vena cava, the aorta and the aortic arch, the pulmonary arteries, the pulmonary veins. This is the ascending aorta. This is the descending aorta down there on the bottom. So you'll need to know all of those pieces. So be sure that you're taking good notes. So the heart, deoxygenated blood returns to the heart from the superior and inferior vena cava. It enters the right atrium. It passes through the right ventricle. From there, it goes into the pulmonary. It is ejected from the right ventricle into the pulmonary artery. It goes to the lungs. The lungs perform gas exchange, and we'll learn more about that when we talk about the pulmonary system. Gas exchange happens on the alveolar level, and then the pulmonary artery brings oxygenated blood back to the heart into the left atrium. It goes through from the left atrium through the mitral valve. into the into the left ventricle, and then out to the aorta. The aorta sends it through the aortic arch. The ascending and descending aorta send it out to the rest of the body. And so, once again, this is a very important piece. Be sure that you're taking good notes. Be sure you're learning this piece because you will need to know it. Okay, so blood vessels. We have arteries and veins. Blood vessels are divided into pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. Arteries are vessels that carry blood away from the heart, and it is usually oxygenated. The only artery that does not contain oxygenated blood in the body is the pulmonary artery. Veins carry deoxygenated blood back towards the heart. So arteries carry blood away from the heart, and veins carry blood towards the heart. Arteries carry oxygenated blood with the exception of the pulmonary artery, and veins carry deoxygenated blood except for the pulmonary vein. Capillaries are very small vessels that allow gas exchange to happen. Nutrient and waste can pass through between the plasma and the interstitial fluid. So that's where gas exchange happens there in the capillaries. And when we look at the pulmonary system, you're going to see that the alveoli look like little grapes, and around the outside of them are these big intricate capillary beds that's where gas exchange happens. Okay, once again, this is the flow of blood in the heart. Be sure that you are familiar with this. This is the blood coming in from the rest of the body. It sends it right atrium, right ventricle, out to the lungs. So it goes out to the lungs. It comes back into the from the pulmonary veins into the left ventricle, through the left atrium, through the left ventricle, and out through the aorta into the rest of the body. So be sure you know that, okay? All right, we are going to stop there. We're going to stop there for today. Be sure your notes are good. Be sure you're ready for your quiz on Monday, that you've done all of your diagrams. You've completed all those. Your in-class proctor your in-class facilitator has the key. So if you finished it, be sure that you finished it with the correct answers. We're going to talk about circulation and blood products next, and then we'll talk about the lungs. So you guys have a great day, and we're going to talk about different vessels and different things and different disorders of the cardiovascular system, and then we'll move on to the lungs. All right, you guys have a great day. I will see you next week.